The first step in making your bucket bag is to make sure you cut out 2 on the fold of the band. It's less curvy, a little wider, because as you cut out, there'll be a place on fold line, and you're going to make sure you cut out 2 of your outside band, 2 of your outside brim, and 1 place on fold for your actual top of your hat. And then you're going to do the same for your lining. So you're going to make sure you have 2 of the brim, 2 of the band, and again another top out of a lining. If you're making your hat out of all one color, you would just make sure you have 2 sets of the same color fabric. You're going to start by grabbing your band pieces. Again, this is the less curvy piece, a little more straight, as opposed to this one. Okay, those ones we're not going to deal with yet. We're going to start with their bands, and you're going to place them right sides together, and you are going to pin down just the 2 little short sides here, and that's what we're going to sew at. The seam allowance on this pattern is the 10 line or the 1 centimeter line, and so you're going to follow that seam allowance throughout this entire pattern. So go ahead and pin your small sides of both your outside bands and your inside bands, because you create 2 hats, and you're going to do the same step to both. So I'm going to grab my sort of mauve colored lining, and I'm going to put right sides together, and I'm also going to pin down just the short sides of these ones. So when sewing your band pieces along the 10 line, you should have a marking that says 10 or 3/8. If your machine doesn't have any kind of markings on it, just follow the outside edge of your presser foot. That will be the similar seam allowance to this. And again, back stitching at beginning and end. So taking a couple stitches forward, a couple back, and going all the way down that seam following that 10 line. So you've just sewn down the small sides of each of your bands. So those bands should now be together, and your lining sewn separately. You're going to do the same thing to your brim now. So you're going to take both your outside brims, which are more curvy. You're going to place them, right sides together again. And you're going to pin down the 2 short sides following the 10 line, back stitching at beginning and end, and join those. And you'll do the same to your lining. So placing those right sides together and pinning down the short side here and the short side on this side as well. Okay, and sewing those, just the short edges at the 10. After you've sewn your 2 short sides on each of your brims, I would go and press all your seams that you've sewn now flat open. This will help in bulk reduction and your seams laying nicely when we join them together, especially for our brim in the next step. So go ahead and press all your little seams flat open like that. We're going to now focus on the brim pieces. So again, these are the more curvy 2 pieces that we have. The square, sort of more rectangular piece, you can keep aside. We're not going to work with the band right now. We're only going to work with our 2 brim pieces. We want to put them right sides together. So if you keep one of your brims inside out like this, I'm going to flip my lining brim right side out. Okay, so I have my really nice side here, and all I'm going to do is I'm going to take my nice one and I'm going to put it inside my inside out one, so that they are essentially going to be tucked in, and the purple one is inside the black one. Okay, and I'm going to start pinning my seams to match along that lower edge. So if I hold this flat here, I'm going to be pinning along the bigger curve right now. I'm not going to pin along my inside curve, only along the whole lower edge. Again, you want to start at your seams to make sure that those line up when you pin them. Okay, and so I'm going to do that right now. I'm going to line up my seams to match, and I'm going to put a pin in here, and then keeping those seams nice and flat open, and then I'm going to go to the other side and do the same to the other seam. And I'm going to line up my seams to match here. Whenever you're pinning around sort of a circle, it helps to kind of pin our halfway marks first, so that our circle sits nicely all the way around our edge. And then you're just going to pin it so that your raw edges match all the way around. And then you're going to sew. So once I've pinned all the way around this circle, I'm going to sew it at the 10 line only on that outside edge. Okay, again, do not sew our inside sort of our donut. Leave that unsewn. So you should have followed the 10 line and sewn all the way around that outside curve like you see here. You're going to notch your edge because you have a convex curve, which is an outside curve. We're actually going to notch it. So it means taking little triangles actually out of your fabric. So I just want to show you what I've clipped out here. So they're actually removing little triangles. You don't want to put your tips past your stitching line when you're cutting, because you could possibly clip through that stitching line and then you will have a hole in your hat. And so if you can see, I'm just doing it about every ½ inch or 1.5 centimeters around this edge. My shears are not passing my stitching line, and I'm just removing these little triangles of fabric. The reason we do this is because when we flip our brim right side out, this will actually become a concave curve and it will squish together. So as it turns, it allows the fabric to close in on itself like this without bubbling. And then when you have a nicely turned edge, it'll be less bulky, it'll sit smoother, look nicer on the outside for when we top stitch. So you get to go and make this sort of look like a edge of a dinosaur all the way around the whole outside edge where we just sewed. Again, every ½ inch to 1.5 centimeters is a nice spacing to do that. When you're finished notching, you should have something that looks like this. And now you're going to go and turn your brim right side out and give it a press along that finished edge. So we're going to flip it all the way up and over so that your lining is now going to stay just tucked in, and you're going to press it all the way along that nice outside edge all the way along. Okay, just to show you up close, I flipped it to the right side out, so I have nice seam on this side, nice seam on that side, and I've given it a nice press along that edge. Again, this side is still left unsewn because that's how I flipped it right side out. We're going to go and top stitch now this outside edge. So top stitching means stitching that shows on the surface. And so I'm going to just take this to the sewing machine and I'm going to tell you a few settings to adjust while we do the top stitching. Okay, a few things to know about top stitching. Top stitching is usually done at 2/8. So on my throat plate here, there is 1/8 and then there is 3/8. So there's 1/8 here and then there's 3/8, and that little tick in between is 2/8. Or if you have a nice clear embroidery foot, that little inside paddle is what I'm following to with the finished edge. I always start at a seam so that my back stitch can happen on somewhere that's not the middle of my brim. So you always want to think of the least noticeable spot. And finally, when you go up to your stitch length, so everybody will have sort of a stitch length there. 2.5 is our normal stitch length. I'm going to increase this just a little bit up to a 3 so that it'll just be a bit longer and sit on the surface and look a little nicer. So I'm going to go ahead and top stitch all the way around, following 2/8 around that finished edge. You've now top stitched along that lower fold and finished edge of our brim. You could be finished this step if you just like the look of one top stitched edge. For the sake of this demo video, I'm going to show you how to do multiple rows going down to give it a different look. This is totally up to you. If you wanted to do the multiple rows, you simply just follow the last line that you sewed with the edge of the foot, starting at that same seam that you have before, and you just keep repeating this over and over again. So I'm going to do another row now, following that last row of stitching with the edge of my foot. So I'm about to start my third row of top stitching. Again, I am following the last row that I just completed with the edge of my foot and doing this until it fills up the entire brim. If you did choose to do your multiple rows of top stitch like I did, you don't have to go all the way. You're going to stop about an inch. It's almost 2 centimeters because you will lose a 10 line here to join it to the band piece. and then that seam is gonna sit right here. So it's gonna kind of replace a look of a row top stitch. So you won't need to continue past that. So I'm gonna just top stitch. I've top stitched 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 rows on my brim piece. Okay, so we're gonna leave our brim now off to the side, and we're gonna go back to working with our band pieces. So these were the straighter sort of rectangular pieces. And we're also gonna work with our circles now. So we're gonna insert the top of our hat into our band pieces. Now this is sort of a challenging step because you're trying to put a rectangle piece around a circle. So on your pattern piece, when you actually cut out, there's a notch right here, and that was marking halfway across, and there is a notch right here as well. So it's very important to mark your quarters, and that's what we're gonna do. So if you didn't mark those when laying out, that's okay. I'm gonna mark my black one first because I have white chalk here. You'll see it in the video better. If I fold my circle in half, just like this, what I've done is I've created half my circle. So I'm gonna go ahead here and mark this little fold with my chalk and draw a little line there, okay? If you don't have chalk at home or that will show up on the fabric you're using, you can just put a little pin in this fold like this, so that it sort of just marks that little spot. I can still open it up flat, but it's just marking halfway. And I'm gonna do that on this end as well. Okay, so I'm just making sure my circle is still nice and in half all the way. And I'm going to make a little white chalk on this end as well. Or in this video, I might put a pin in there as well so you can see it a little bit better, because that white chalk might be a little faint. Okay, so I'm gonna just put a pin in there and sort of mark that halfway mark. So now what I've done is I have pins halfway across from each other, and so I'm gonna fold my circle that opposite way. So I'm gonna fold it so that my pins now line up at the top, and I'm going to mark my quarters. Okay, so again, I'm gonna give myself a little bit of a white chalk line here and put a pin in there so that everybody can kind of see this. Okay, and then same thing, I'm going to do the other side. So I'm going to still make sure that my pins haven't moved on me, they're lining up, and I'm going to mark this fold as well. I'm going to lay this flat for you so you can see what we've accomplished by doing this. So I'll put my last pin in that little folded edge there, and I'm just sort of hooking that fold. I'm not really pinching it because I can still lay my piece really flat. There's no bubble there or bump, and so I have 4 pins equal distances around my piece. Okay, and so now what we're going to do is we're going to take our matching band. So I have my black band here. I'll just move my purple circle out of the way, and it has a slight curve to it. Okay, so we have a smaller curve because these slightly angle out into a bigger curve. This top will go in the smaller curve. So we're going to find the middles between our stitching lines. And the way I do that is I just sort of pin my seams together there. If I match those seams up, I'm doing the exact same thing. I'm pinning across from it, or I'll make my mark. Okay, I'll also put a pin in there in case that white line is hard to see in the video. And just hooking that fold. And then same thing, I'm going to make sure that these seams didn't separate or move on me. And I'm going to bring it over to this side and do the same mark halfway and put a pin in. Okay, so what we have now, similar to what we've done with our circle, is we have sort of 4 spots. We have our seam, a pin, a seam, and a pin. So we have quarters around our band as well. Okay, so now we're going to join the two. So I'm holding my band around my hand. So it's like a big circle with the smaller side, so the one that I've marked with my pins closest to my fingers. And I have my circle, and this is my good side, okay? This side's my bad side. It has my chalk markings on it. So I have my good side right here. It is closest to my hand. And all I'm gonna do is bring the two together, and I'm gonna match one of those sets of pins up. It doesn't matter which one you match because it's a circle, okay? It's the exact same thing going around the whole thing. So I'm gonna match two of my pins on my band and my circle, and I'm gonna take my pin out and I'm gonna just pin it through both. Okay, so you can kind of see that my band's here and my circle is starting to get pinned around my band. Okay, my next pin, as I twirl this, will hit the seam of my band. So I'm going to match my seam right up with the pin on my circle. And I'm going to take that pin out and replace it through both of them, trying to keep that seam allowance flat open on my band. Okay, so now I have two pins, so I keep spinning my band around, and I'm going to match my other set of pins now and make sure those line up and pin them together. So I'll take out one of these pins and poke it through both sets now. Okay, and so now I am finishing off the circle with my last seam matching my last pin over here. So there should be sort of 4 major marking spots pinned on your hat and around your band. I'm going to put one more pin in there just to hold my seam allowance flat open. I like to usually use 2 pins to hold them each open. So if I show you this from sort of far away, I've dropped my hat top sort of around my band like so. And if I looked inside here and you had a print, if I looked into my circle, this would be my good side and this would be my good side. So I'd be staring at my good side inside and staring at my outside and bad sides when it's flipped up like this. Now I get the fun of what's called easing around a curve. So I use my 2 palms and I grab sort of my 2 pinning sites and I push my thumbs right into that curve like this, like it would go around my head. And I push them all the way up, and then I kind of pinch it at the middle right here, and I put a pin in to hold that easing nice and even. And now I have a smaller middle, so I always work with middles. Then I can push into this little section and it will go nice and smooth in there. And again, circles are our hardest thing, so go a little crazy with pins. I tend to put a lot of pins when I sew curves, okay? And then same thing, I'm gonna push my thumbs right into that curve. And it might look wavy on the top, but when you sew along the 10 line, it looks completely smooth. Okay, I'm gonna show you that kind of up close here. It might look like a little wavy right here, but when you ultimately sew along the 10 line, there's no pucker. There's no bulge or anything that's going to get a fold in it. And that's why it was so important to pin our 4 sort of corners of a circle so that we evenly ease this fullness of a curve all the way around. So you're going to keep sort of thumbing the curves or easing the curves just like I've showed you, where you grab both sides and you just sort of push your thumbs right into that center of that curve and keep pinning all the way around this circle. So I just want to show you just how many pins I have put in my circle all the way around. Okay, so it should look like this all the way around. Again, you are staring at your seam allowances, and it doesn't matter where you're going to start. We're going to do 10 line all the way around this circle. Okay, so you should have sewn all the way around that circle now. We are going to notch again around this edge, which is exactly like we did with the brim, in which our scissors don't go over our stitching line, and we're removing those lovely little triangles from our seam allowance, spacing them about a 1/2 inch to 5/8 around, so trimming or notching around the entire circle. Once you've done that, you get to do the exact same thing with your other set. Okay, finding your quarters and making this exact same shape as you did with these ones. Because this step is confusing, I'm going to show you it again with the lining. I have my band inside out, so I see my seams. I've marked my middles between my seams along the smaller curve, okay, because it angles out and that's a little bit bigger. So I've marked it along my smaller curve. I'm putting my hand in between the band so my fingers come out where I've marked it. I have my quarters marked on my circle all the way around. I'm going to take this is my good side just for this demo so you can see my chalk marks. I'm going to take my good side towards my hand and I'm going to pin it matching those markings. So I'm going to line up those two marks, or if you use pins, you're lining up your pins. And I'm going to put a pin in there to hold that quarter. Okay, and then I'm going to spin it until my seam. So I'm going to match my seam to my marking on my top of my hat, and I'm going to put a pin in there to hold it, and then I'm going to spin again around my hat until I reach my next marking and line those up. Put a pin in that one, and then the last one of my hat will be this marking at my seam. Okay, so lining up those 4 major marking spots, which are your quarters around both your hat and your band. And so again, this is what you sort of have. You have a circle that's been placed into your band, and now you're going to grab each side here and you're going to ease in that fullness and push it along each of those corners till it fits in smoothly. When sewing the top of the hat into the band, I would keep the band piece up and that circle piece down so that you can see if any of this sort of band is getting caught up in your seam. Okay, so if you put it in along the circle, then again, like I said, you could sew a little bit. You also know how much you have to sort of give it a tiny bit of a pull in between your seams so that again, none of this is creeping up without you feeling it or seeing it as you sew it. So you should now have 2 sort of top hats into your bands, and you've notched all the way around your edges on both of these. I would take this to the iron now, and I would iron out your curved seam using a ham. If you don't have a ham at home, you could roll up a towel and get it into the curve so it's easier to press along a curved edge. So I have my ham just tucked in, and I'm using the curved edge of the ham to really get a nice press along that curved edge before I start attaching the brim to it so that it sits and is more symmetrical and circular than maybe a little jagged without being pressed yet. So after you've pressed around the curve of your hat, you're going to leave your hat right side out so you have the nice seam here. We're going to now pick up our brim, and we're going to place them again. My outside is the black, and my inside is sort of this mauvey color. So I'm going to take my hat and I'm going to place my brim inside out, and I'm going to drop my hat inside that unfinished edge of the brim. Okay, and you will see that you have seams here. So again, I'm going to just show you that one more time. Maybe I'll take it out this way. If you keep your brim inside out so that your outside colors to the inside, and you take your hat and it's right side out, and you just tuck it into the little donut, the hole, you will have good sides touching each other. So right now I have black brim touching black hat. I'm gonna line up my seams because there's a seam here and there's a seam on my hat. We're gonna line up that seam all together right there, and we're going to put a pin in there so our intersecting seams match. And then we're gonna spin it around again, and we're gonna do the same to the other seam on the other side. So keeping that seam allowance on your hat nice and flat open, you're gonna take the two seams on your brim and your hat, lining those up and putting a pin in there. Okay, so now, similar to when we put the circle in, this is a little easier because it's rectangular and it sits nicer, but you are going to pin all the way around your entire brim, around this entire circle, and sew this at the 10 line. So when sewing around your hat, it might be easier if you had a removable arm that comes off, because it is circular. That way you can tuck your hat around the bottom and nothing gets caught up. I'm going to just tuck it into my machine here, and I'm going to lower my foot against the 10 line and sew all the way around, and that way nothing's getting caught up. It's just spinning along and around that free arm. So now you've attached one of the, the brim to the outside hat. We still have a lining hat part that we haven't attached, but the main brim is attached to the outside actual hat now. So we're gonna put it back like the way you sewed it, sort of looking like, it's inside out. So here's my sort of hole of my hat with my bad side and my lining brim. And if we take this side of our hat now, and same thing, I have mine still inside out. Okay, so my good side's on the inside. I'm gonna take my whole hat, so the entire thing, and I'm gonna tuck it into my lining. Okay, so I'm hiding that brim. The brim is not sticking out. That brim is getting tucked into my little bucket. Okay, and last thing, same thing, is you're gonna line up your seams. So sort of look when you're dropping it in that you have the seam from your brim again, lining up with the seam on the outside here. So we're gonna line up our seams, and you're gonna pin those ones first. So I'm just gonna look down here and line up those seams, and I'm gonna put a pin in there to hold that one in place. And then same thing, we're gonna spin it around to the other side, and there's my other seam, and I'm gonna line it up with this seam on this side. We always want intersecting seams to match. And we're gonna put a pin in this one to hold that one. And now you're gonna pin all the way around this circle. Now, just like a lining in a bag, we're gonna leave a section open. So about a hand width apart, so probably about 4 inches open. So I'm gonna go ahead and pin this, and then I'm gonna just show you how I'm gonna leave a little opening to flip this hat right side out. Okay, just to double check you have pinned this right, you should be looking at your seam allowances on your lining and on your inside as well, so that there's no nice side right now that you can see. I have seam allowances here and seam allowances here. I have pinned my circle all the way around, making sure that all the edges, line up and match, that one's not dropped down. And my brim is hiding in between these layers. My brim isn't sitting outside. Okay, it's tucked in. We want to leave an opening now. So somewhere on, the straight edge here, not on the seam, I would do it somewhere in the middle. I'm going to place a double pin right in here. And so what a double pin to me symbols is a start and a stop. And then I'm going to give about 4 fingers, and I'm going to put a double pin at this little pin here, okay? So I just took that one out to remove it. I'm going to leave this opening open, no sewing. So I'm going to start right here and around my 10 line. I'm going to sew again all the way, and I'm going to stop there. Back stitching at beginning and end, not sewing in there, because that's where I'm going to actually flip my hat right side out. So just a tip when sewing this, my lining side has no stitching because that's the part I just pinned to the rest of the hat. And my outside has that line where I already attached the brim to. If I keep it in the machine like this, then I can sew just inside this line. So just inside of it here, so that when I flip my hat around, I won't actually see that first line of stitching that I did when I attached my brim to the outside of my hat. If I stitched kind of on this side of the line at some points, you would see a little extra line of stitching. Okay, so I have it with my outside hat face up, not with my lining, so that I can see my existing line. And I ideally want to stitch towards the hat, just a little bit inside of there, not towards the seam allowance part. So I'm following more of a 4/8 line right now than a 3/8, so that yes, my line is just going inside my existing stitching. So I've left an opening right here where I didn't sew. The rest of the way is sewn all the way around. I would trim this seam allowance to half, maybe avoiding where we will slip stitch. So for instance, again, I'm not going to put my scissors past my stitching line, but I am going to go in there and sort of do a half clip, and then I'm going to get rid of about half this width here. So I'm going to come in here and I'm going to trim away about half that width from that seam to bulk reduce, making sure I'm not catching up any of my hat at this point, but just to reduce that to a smaller width. So just cutting away about half that width all the way around, just not where the opening is. It'll give you a little more room to catch for a slip stitch. So go ahead and trim all the way around that hat. Okay, so you have your opening here where you didn't sew, and now you're going to go in between your lining and you're going to actually flip your hat right side out. So this is kind of a slower process. You just have to be patient. You kind of just grab slowly at your hat and keep turning the rest of the hat as you kind of push it through the hole from, you know, the back side here. So a little bit at a time, you're kind of pushing, and at the same time you're kind of grabbing the hat to come out the right way around. So what you have now is that seam now will hide the inside. So essentially it could be worn two ways, completely reversible. And we're left with a little opening where we flipped our bag through. So what you want to do is you want to turn under that seam allowance that we left. So that's about a 1/2 inch, just a generous centimeter almost. And you want to place it right along that seam line where we attached our brim the first time. So it just kind of covers that up like this. Okay, and you're going to pin it along your hat nice and smoothly so that there's no you know, puckering, and it covers that seam line. And just put some pins in there to hold it sort of in place. And then we're going to use a hand needle and thread, and we're going to do a slip stitch. So I'm just going to pin this sort of, like I said, in place here. Get rid of that little thread that's hanging out, or tuck it in. Give it a clip so it doesn't hang out. And yes, we're going to get a needle and thread threaded up with some matching thread color. So I'm going to teach you how to do a slip stitch now. All I've done is I've threaded up my needle. I have pulled both ends sort of even with the bottom. I'm going to knot my thread ends together here. So I'm grabbing my ends and I'm going to make a messy knot with my ends. So I'm grabbing my ends here. I wrap it around my finger. I kind of form an X, and then I roll it on off and I pull down on it. And what it forms is a messy knot. Okay, so you are going to, let's see if you can get that in a clear image. There we go. You can just clip off after your knot any little threads. It's going to be hidden here. So when we get onto our actual opening, I'm going to open up where my pin was to hold it shut, just so I can tuck my thread in. So there's the start of my gap. I'm going to take my hand needle and I'm going to sort of go into the hole, and then I'm going to come out right on some stitching in the fold before it ended. So I can get this through the camera. There we go. Okay, so let's see. So I'm coming out through the kind of hat part, but on close to the seam right before the stitching ended. Okay, and my knot's in towards the inside, and you want to try to use as close to a matching thread color as possible for your lining. Now wherever I came out, so I'm on the bottom fold here, I'm gonna go just straight across. So where I came out here, I go right below and I just run it along that edge for about 1/2 centimeter like that. Okay, and then wherever I came out the brim, so I'm now on my brim edge, wherever I came out there, I gotta go straight across into the fold of my hat. So my needle is always staying horizontal. Okay, it's never going down and then back up. My needle stays horizontal and it's just grabbing the fold of my hat there. Okay, and when we don't travel, it leaves a little invisible line. If I suddenly jumped from this over there, you would see my whole line of thread jump. So if I go right below where I came out, so I came out right here, but on my hat, I'm going to go directly down, but onto the brim side this time, and I'm going to tuck it in to the brim for again about 1/2 centimeter. Okay, now I'm not going on to the outside here. If I do, I'm going to see a little ticky of not very nice colored thread, because this sort of mauvey color would sure show up on my black side. So just always give it a check that you don't see your needle poking through. You're just grabbing that lining and you pull it through. So it's just an alternating, a little bit of this fold wherever you left off, and then straight back down into the fabric. And again, always just ensuring you don't see it on this side until you reach the end. So keep on doing that and I'll show you how to knot off. Okay, so I have finished slip stitching all the way along, and again, it should be invisible. You should just see, if you really look closely, these little ticks along the way. I've closed up my hole, so now I'm going to knot off. So the way you knot off is you just grab a little bit of where you ended. So I'm just going to hook the tiniest bit about of my lining fabric like this. And then you see this loop that's forming. If I put my needle through that loop, that is once. And then I go right back where I ended again. So I grab a little bit of that same sort of spot, pull my thread, but not, all the way until you see your little loop. Hook your needle through that loop, pull it tight, and that is 2 times. So then you can cut really close to that knot. This is on the inside of your hat, and you are done. So you have a nice slip stitched edge. You have a beautiful bucket hat as your finished product. And it can be worn reversible because there's no seam showing. So hope you guys enjoyed that tutorial. Please like or subscribe for more easy to do little projects.